when we call him up. So when you do the introduction, then he'll come up. Yeah, and then we'll take it from there. Yeah, okay. Good morning. Oh, you are freezing cold just like me. I know it is very cold, but good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you all. And we are so grateful that you are here today. And welcome to Prophetica. We are thankful that you accepted the invitation to come join us today and learn about the history of tomorrow. So my name is Bridget Ralebala, and this is Naomi Hanbury.
Hello.
We will be your hosts for today. And we welcome all our visitors here, and I know most of you need to know where the restrooms are because the last thing you want is to be searching for it. So I'll give you a direction on how to get there. So the same door that you came in through, you just come along the passage here and turn left. And the male door is on the right-hand side. And then 3 doors later is the female bathroom. So if you forget, just come get me. I'll show you how to get there. And also, if you need anything at all, the ladies that welcomed you at the back there, just ask one of them and they will assist you. And if you need a drink of water, we'll have water at the back for you. Another thing to be mindful of is mobile phones. If you can put them on a silent, mute, or turn them off, please, that would be wonderful so that they don't distract us. And also, just to give you a rundown of what's going to be happening today, we have 5 sessions altogether, but before lunch we'll only do 3 of them. So we'll have the first session with Gary, and after that we'll have a 5-minute break where we will swap over to Peter, and then Peter will do session 2. And then when he finishes, he's kind enough to give you 15 minutes break to stretch and do a bathroom trip and come back again. And then Peter will lead us into 3rd session. And then, because you have been waiting for 3 sessions, you can have a well-deserved lunch provided for you. Isn't that wonderful? And then after that, after lunch, depending on how quick we eat it, we'll be back again for our 4th session. And after the 4th session, there will be another 15-minute break and have the 5th session. So just to give you an idea of what is going to happen today. So we won't be keeping you sitting for 3 hours straight. No. We need to stretch and get the blood flowing and concentrating as well. So now I'll just hand over to Naomi to introduce our first speaker for today.
Lovely. Thank you, Bridget. I'm Naomi Hanbury, and welcome everyone. It's such a beautiful day, a beautiful sunny winter's day. We're so fortunate to have such a beautiful day to come out in, so I'm so glad that you're all here today. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you all our fabulous speaker this morning, the internationally renowned speaker, Gary Webster. So if you'd like to come up, Gary.
I was wondering who you were talking about.
Yes, it's you. Welcome. And so lovely to meet you.
Good to be here.
Hello.
Good, Naomi. Thank you.
I thought I'd just ask a couple of questions just so we can get to know you a little bit. And I know your beautiful sister is here, Del Shannon, and I know she lives here. So I was surmising then that perhaps you grew up in Perth?
Yes, down the road at Midland.
Right. So I thought...
I've got another sister here too today.
Have you got 2? I'm sorry I missed her out. Hello. So I thought maybe if you tell us where you were born, where you have lived, and where you're living now.
Yeah, as I said, just down at Midland is where we came from. And after that we've lived in New Zealand, Fiji, the States for a little while, Canberra, and now we're in Sydney and Tasmania as well. So yeah, lived around a little bit.
Fabulous. And I know today you're going to be telling us lots of interesting stories, but I did know that you have been to the Middle East a lot for some very interesting reasons. I know you're going to sort of explain all of that to us today. Something that people might not know about me is that when I was a child, I wanted to be an archaeologist. Also a spy and a magician, but we won't talk about that now. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in archaeology, and maybe, I know you're going to expand on it today, but maybe a little bit about your favourite dig that you were on that maybe stays with you today, that you really comes to mind as for a particular
question,
reason?
Naomi.
Okay.
Yeah, I've had an interest in archaeology for many years now. Maybe I'll say something about why a little later on. But yes, in my work, we studied at Andrews University in the States, because that has an archaeological school, if you like. So digging in the Middle East, in Israel and Jordan. In fact, Peter and I were on a dig together on one occasion, so he may say something about that. Okay. But yes, and as also in my work, I take tours to the Middle East to see some of the things that archaeologists have discovered, from anywhere from Iran through to Greece and Turkey and Egypt, all over the Middle East there. So I said the most interesting dig.
Yeah, well, maybe just something that really comes to mind that is stood out for you, and for what reason? Yeah.
It would be digging in Jordan, because my family, my wife and two daughters, were digging at that time in Amman, just outside of Amman, and we had left a little piece of dirt about so big in the middle of the square, and my daughter said to me, "Dad, can I kick that in?" I was the supervisor, and it's only a little bit. I said, "Sure, kick it in." So when she gave it a kick, out comes this little cosmetic pellet from about 2,700 years ago. So
amazing.
It was for putting on the rouge on the face and so on, and that really tickled my daughter's fancy, and now she actually is an archaeologist living in Vienna. So
is that right?
Yeah, she's always going to Israel, and so she's left her dad way behind.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that's the most important dig for me.
Well, that's amazing how children are influenced like that. Yeah. That's brilliant. Well, thank you, Gary, for sharing that. And I know that Gary's got a lot of other wonderful things to share with us now, so I'll hand it over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Naomi. Well, good to be with you all again this morning. Remember, it was about last year, sometime in September, I think we were here, as I recall. So glad that we can be with you again. By the way, at the end of the last session, we have some things that we'd like to give you. We have summaries of all the 5 presentations that Peter and I will be giving today. So make sure you get the 5 summaries as you leave. And then we have a couple of magazines that we'd like to put into your hand. One on Egypt and one on Israel, okay? So make sure you get one of those, at least one for the family. We do have another seminar tomorrow, so we've got to make sure they have enough as well, but we think we're pretty right. So make sure you get those. It'll help you as you perhaps want to look up and check on what Peter and I have been saying through the day. All right, let's go to our first session for this day. I want to look at lost civilisations and how they help reveal the future. We're going to take some interesting journeys today through both Peter's presentations and my own. You can go to the British Museum and other great museums like the Louvre Museum and the Pergamon Museum in Berlin and France, and you will notice sometimes you can see some of these clay tablets. These are made of clay, and they've got what we call Cuneiform Script. This is the script of Mesopotamia that was used. Now, the ancients were very interested in trying to tell the future. This is a bird omen tablet. By the sort of the flight patterns of the birds and so on, they felt they could predict what was coming in the future. I'm not quite sure how that happens, but that's what they believed. Here's another one. This is the sheep's stomach omen tablet. So you cut a sheep's stomach out, and depending on the colorations and so on, that's going to tell you what's coming next in your love life or something. So the ancients were very interested. We can come here to Greece, to Delphi. Delphi is the place where we have the famous oracle. Way back in time, they had these priestesses, if you like, or they called them Pythia. This is the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and they sat on a tripod over a crack in the ground, and gases were coming up, and these women were supposed to be able to predict the future. Some very famous people consulted the oracles of Delphi, people like Alexander the Great and even the Emperor Nero. So you can appreciate ancient people wanted to know the future. They wanted to know where were they headed in their time. And of course, many people are asking that very same question today, especially in the light of what's taking place in our world, such things as the Ukraine crisis. Many people are very anxious, and well, the world should be. If you notice what's taking place and how that people are talking all sorts of dangerous language. The increasing US-China tensions have many people anxious today as to what is coming in this space. And then, of course, COVID-19. It's not certainly going to be the last of the pandemics that we have. And what about climate change? This has many, many scientists very anxious today. Rising crime rates in our world, in our cities, even here in Australia. And then, of course, we don't even need to say much about this, because if you've got your superannuation package, you'll notice it's gone down in the last few weeks, because the world is almost like a global economic house of cards. It's not if, it's when is it going to happen. Many people today are asking that very question for some of those reasons and many more. What does the future hold for our world? You go home and you Google prophecy. I did it last night just to check up where we're at. Over 332 million hits. Last time I looked, I think it was last year, it was 186 million. Predictions, this is even more powerful. Look at this, 1.95 billion hits. Last time I looked, it was 880-something million. Now, just last night, people are thinking, where are we headed in the world? What does the future hold? Think about the increased column centimetres given in the glossy magazines and the newspapers to the horoscopes, astrologers and so on. Increased astronomically over the last 40 years because people want to know, not just about what my job's coming, what my love life's going to be like, but where on earth are we heading? I was down here in Benares in India on the Ganges River. Now, this is a very famous place for the Hindu people, but I noticed here, right here in the heart of Hinduism, here was someone had set up their astrology shop because they want to know where are we headed, even, of course, down there. Remember the year 2012 and the Mayan calendar and the end of the world and all that? You know, many predictions were being made about what was going to happen in our world. But what happened? Well, nothing happened. Now, I'm not knocking any of the psychics at all. I'm simply saying it's not easy to predict the future. Even worse, when we go back to the year 2000, remember that? Y2K and all those sort of things. The world was going to come crumbling come to a grounding halt. Many people predicted, lots of predictions about the end of the world in the year 2000. But what happened? Well, nothing happened. Simply making the point, it is very difficult to predict the future because right around the world, thousands of people, many psychics were making predictions, but actually nothing happened. I noticed in These Times magazine, they did a survey on the predictions of the psychics. 6 out of 250 predictions were correct. That's 3%. You could guess at it and do just as good pretty much. Not easy to predict the future. That's the point we're making. In actual fact, the average leading psychic's batting average is 16%. So for every 100 predictions that are made, only 16 out of the 100 are actually correct. Wow. Not easy to predict the future, which brings us to this vital question. Can we actually know the future, or is this just wishful thinking on our part as human beings? What is the story here? Well, if you wanted to have came to a source or a person or some book that says, look, I can predict the future, you would want 2 essentials for knowing the future to make sure you've got the right source. Number 1, you would want historical accuracy, meaning if they can't even get the facts right of what's happening in the world today or in the past, how can you trust them what they're going to say about the future? You'd want that sort of confidence that they get the facts right. Number 2, you would want a proven track record of fulfilled predictions, meaning they've got dependable predictions. 16% is not good enough, especially if you're on the wrong side of the 16%. if what they predict about you or what's something you're involved with, and it's in the 84%, not good news, is it, for us? So you'd want a source that's got a batting average of what? 100%. So that they're going to make predictions and they always come out. So that's what we're talking about. We need that. Now, is there such a source? Yes, there absolutely is, and we're going to be sharing that with you this today. You'll see very clearly from two sources. Peter and I are going to go to university history, and we're going to go to archaeology, because both of us have had the privilege to work in these two areas. And we're going to share you a lot of evidence today that will help you see, yes, we can, and we have a source that knows that. Let's begin with archaeology, and we're going to go to the ancient land of the Niles, Egypt. Anybody been to Egypt, by the way? Right, we have a few people that have been to Egypt. It's a beautiful place to visit, in my opinion. I like going to Egypt. I love the people, and I love the places. But we're going to go back to the time of 1798 and Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had come down to Egypt with his soldiers, and they were doing some digging in the delta area of the Nile, up the top there, and they discovered this famous stone known as the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, you'll see, is famous because it helped them to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs. For centuries, people had been travelling to ancient Egypt, but they couldn't read what was on the walls of the tombs and the temples and in the pyramids and so on. They didn't have a clue what was on the papyrus or the paper documents. You'll notice the Rosetta Stone is divided into three. This is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, which nobody could read at this point in time. Then we have a cursive Egyptian script called Demotic. They couldn't read that either. The bottom section is in Greek, and of course they could read that. They assumed, and they assumed correctly, that this was the same message in three different scripts. So they worked from the known language, the Greek down at the bottom, and they worked on this, especially a Frenchman, a brilliant Frenchman by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion. He worked on this thing for 20 years with others, and finally they were able to read the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, what did this mean? We'll come to Iran in a minute. It simply meant that they could now begin to understand the history, the cultural practices, the religious beliefs and so on of one of the greatest civilizations of ancient times, Egypt. Let's go to the second of the three great discoveries, or the most important discoveries as far as archaeology is really concerned, for opening up the world. That one is in Iran. I visited Iran 3 times, and I tell you what, some of the most friendly people you'll find on the planet are Iranians. Peter, we were there together back in 2019. A fascinating place to visit, very friendly people, and people who are interested in talking with you. Very great people. By the way, I only saw one gun in all of Iran, and that was on a guy on a guard tower in an army base where you'd expect to see a gun, of course. But if you go to Israel, every man, woman and his dog has almost got a gun, if you've been there. Anyway, it's a lovely place to visit. But Iran is famous for archaeologists, especially because of what we find at a place called Histon, just outside of the Iranian city of Kermanshah. We have this great cliffs. This is, by the way, on the Silk Road that went from Asia right through these parts. Now, on the cliffs, they've left some graffiti. Graffiti is not new. Goes way back, and the kings graffitied these cliffs. But the most famous one is this one here by Darius II, or Darius the Great. It's called the Histon Inscription. Not so much famous for the story that it tells, but for the fact that it's written in 3 different scripts of what we call the Cuneiform Script, which was used in Mesopotamia. We would say Iraq, parts of Iran, and parts of Turkey today. And thanks to people like Henry Rawlinson, a British soldier, after working on these 3 different scripts, they were able to decipher the Cuneiform Script. Now, there are literally thousands of clay tablets in the museums today. In the British Museum, there are scores of tablets they've not even yet read, because it's very difficult to learn this script, the cuneiform. And so these clay tablets help us to unlock the history, the culture, the religious beliefs and so on of what many believe is the cradle of human civilization, Mesopotamia. So we can unlock that. You're going to see how that becomes important even toward the end of this session. The third of the most significant discoveries in archaeology was here in Israel on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. In 1947, here at Qumran, a young Bedouin boy and a couple of his friends were minding the clan's goats in this area here. Now you can see there are caves up here. And one of the goats strayed into one of the many caves in this area. The boys threw a rock at it to get it back, missed the goat. The rock went inside the cave and they heard the sound of breaking pots. So they raced up there thinking they might get treasure, but all they found were these old pots. And inside some of them were some very old scrolls. And the Bedouin boys, they took them to their Bedouin clan here in this area. And the Bedouin clan took them to Bethlehem, where there was an antiquities dealer by the name of Mr. Kando, who purchased them for the pricely sum of $100. Just a few years later, those same scrolls sold for $500,000. These scrolls were selling for. They're in fact priceless scrolls today, and they're famously known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These become very important to us for three reasons. Why are they so valuable? Number one, they're very old. Anything old seems to fetch a price, doesn't it? How old are they? Well, we now know, thanks to the work of scholars, how old they are. First of all, the style of the script, because script styles change through time. For example, if you try reading 16th century English, I guarantee most of us won't have a clue what's going on there. All right? Because script styles change through time. Well, they did in ancient times. And scholars know the time period the style of the scripts come from. They also did radiocarbon dating on them. And finally, they found coins in some of the caves with some of the scrolls, because they went searching for more. They all date back to 100 to 200 BC. So we know they are that old, 100 to 200 years before the time of Christ. Now, the second reason that they're very important, especially today, is this. These scrolls contain ancient predictions with a proven track record, and you're going to see that very clearly this morning, especially in the second presentation that Peter shares. You will see how this works out even more. Thirdly, what are these scrolls? Well, they discovered that some of these scrolls contained the rules of the monks who wrote them. These were a group of Jewish monastic fellows who lived out in the Judean desert, and they discovered some of them were concerning their practices, their rules of their society. The biggest portion of them, some 40%, were what we call the Bible, the Old Testament part of the Bible. Every book except the book of Esther was found among them. In other words, the first part, if you've never noticed the Bible, maybe in a motel room or you've got one at home, it's divided into two sections, New and Old. Well, they found the Old Testament part because, of course, this is BC. Now, what we can now do is we can check up on this with the Bible. By the way, the scholars thought maybe if you copy the Bible enough times, or these scrolls, you'll introduce mistakes. You know, like when you play Chinese whispers, if I whisper in this gentleman's ear here, we pass it around the room, when Peter passes it back, it's going to be all gobbledygook. They thought that's what would happen when you copy. So the scholars could now check this up. And when they compared the Bible that you may have in your home or in the motel room with what they had back then, it's essentially the same in meaning. And we now know one of the reasons why is because Jewish scribes were very particular in the way they copied. For example, sometimes scribes would copy a document. They would count the words to make sure there were the same number of words in their copy from what they were copying from. And if it wasn't, sometimes they'd screw the thing up, throw it in the rubbish bin and start all over again. Now, they found almost they found two copies of the book of Isaiah, almost the whole of the book of Isaiah in both of them, 9 meters long, each book. Imagine if you made a boo-boo on the last... Mamma mia. Start again. Now that's why they can see these scrolls are so, the Bible hasn't changed. They're very particular. All right, so we can now check these two things up, and that's what some of the things we're going to do today to make sure. Is this a document that you can say this predicts the future, and you're going to see very clearly? All right, let's look first of all at historical accuracy. Remember, there's two things. Is it historically accurate? Does it get the facts right of its time, or does it have a whole bunch of mistakes in it? And then the prophetic side. Let's go with the evidence. First of all, I want to take you to a place called Moab. Moab was an ancient civilization this is Jordan today, this area, part of Jordan. Now, I want to read something from the biblical manuscripts, the Bible, which you have maybe in your home, and we're going to compare it with what the archaeologists have discovered, okay? So let's go to the Bible first. 9th century BC, this story comes from, in the biblical times. So it talks about a king of Mesha of Moab's rebellion. Let's read it. Now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep master, and he had to pay the king of Israel, whose name was Omri, the wool of 100,000 lambs and of 100,000 rams. He's probably a Kiwi with all those sheep, isn't he? But it came to pass when Ahab, the son of Omri, was dead, that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel, Jehoram, son of Ahab, at that time. Now, you could go to the Louvre Museum in Paris today, and make sure if you ever go to Paris, go to the Louvre Museum. It's stocked full of stuff, especially that shows the historical accuracy of the biblical manuscripts. Well, we're just looking at one here. Now, you can see the Moabite, or the Mesha stele as it's called, and it dates back to the 9th century BC, the very time. And when scholars read this Moabite stone, or stele, notice what they found on it. I am Mesha, king of Moab. Omri, king of Israel, had oppressed Moab many days, but I have triumphed over his house, meaning his descendants who come from him. Now, when scholars read that so long ago and checked it with, they could say someone's got some stuff right here. Someone didn't cook this story up. Someone must have lived back at those times and wrote it down. Let's go to ancient Babylon for another example. We want to come to the time of around 600 BC. Babylon was a great city in what we call Iraq today, the ancient city of Babylon in Iraq. Now, the king at the time that I want to talk about is a very famous king in the biblical manuscripts, the Bible, mentioned many times, Nebuchadnezzar II. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, according to the Bible, made 3 raids on the city of Jerusalem down in Palestine, we call it today, don't we? Or Israel. 605 was his first raid, 597 his second, and 586 BC his third. Now, notice this. In the British Museum, you can actually see this tablet here. Notice the Nebuchadnezzar part of the Babylonian Chronicle. It mentions his second raid, 597 BC, his second raid. When you go, they found another tablet, and this talks about a guy called Nebo-Sar-Sechem, the Rabsaris or chief official. Quite a mouthful, isn't it? This is his third raid. I want you to notice what the Bible says, and then let's see what they found. This is when he attacks the city of Jerusalem and takes it out eventually. All the officials of the king of Babylon came and took seats in the middle gate of the city, that is. Nergal-Sharezer of Samgar, Nebo-Sar-Sechem, a chief officer, Nergal-Sharezer, a high official, and all the other officials of the king of Babylon. About 3 or 4 or 5 years ago now, someone was reading tablets in the British Museum, and they found this one. And they discovered this is the very guy the Bible mentions, a very minor person as far as the kings of Babylon are concerned, a high official back in them, but no one had hardly heard of him in history. Nebo-Sar-Sechem, the Rabsaris or chief official. You see, this is why the Bible has to be taken seriously, at least for its historical accuracy. We haven't got to the prophecy part yet, but it gets it right. Let's go to another example. The Babylonians in Iraq used many different ways to try to predict the future. Many, many ways. In fact, you can go to the British Museum and especially the Louvre Museum and you'll see all their magical texts and their texts that they try to use, their clay tablets, to predict the future and so on. Heaps of different ways they tried to predict the future. Here's one. We call it the Liver Omen. Now, when we go to the biblical records, this is what it says in one place in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is living in 600 BC. He's actually living in Babylon himself. For the king of Babylon stands at the parting of the road, at the fork of the two roads. In other words, the king's got to make a decision. Is he going to go here or is he going to go there? Is he going to go to war or is he not going to go to war? He's got to make a decision. We use those words today, don't we? We're at the fork of the roads. To use divination, that's magic. He shakes the arrows, another form of trying to predict the future. He consults the images, his gods, and he looks at the liver. What on earth is he looking at the liver for? What does that mean? Well, we know what that means now very clearly, because if you go to the British Museum and other museums, you will see these clay livers. These are liver omen tablets. Evidently, they cut out a sheep's liver. They look at it, the colorations, the patterns. Oh, according to the liver omen, you're going to die tomorrow, king, in Babylon. So what's he going to do? He's going to go to another city. So he's not there in Babylon tomorrow to avert the disaster. So they use this trying to predict the future to avert tragedy or to get the good things, whatever it was, the prediction. So this is very clear. The Bible had this already mentioned in its records. Nebuchadnezzar's 3 raids on Jerusalem, he took prisoners from Jerusalem to Babylon, according to the Bible. One of those prisoners was Daniel, the prophet Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel is a 6th century BC book, and Peter's going to show us that clearly. It's very important that you know that, and Peter's going to show how we know that in the next presentation. But the book of Daniel is a favourite of these people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have many fragments that they've discovered from the book of Daniel. Why? Because this book contains ancient predictions with a proven track record, and you're going to see 2 of them today that take us right down to our own time. One that we're going to deal with half of it, and in the presentations that are coming up that will be run here, you will see the second half of that, but we're going to show you one that takes us very clearly to our own time today. All right, these are predictions that concern our day in the book of Daniel, and we know how old this dates back to. Now, Daniel says that Nebuchadnezzar was the founder of what we call the New Babylon. It had been destroyed a lot by the Assyrians before, and Nebuchadnezzar embellishes it. And that's true. We know that's true, because if you go to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, for example, you will see the famous Ishtar gates that the Germans who excavated Babylon pulled to pieces and reassembled in their museum in Berlin. And on the edge of the Ishtar gates it says this: I, Nebuchadnezzar, laid the foundation of the gates. Not only that, but you can see bricks in museums with Nebuchadnezzar's name on them from ancient Babylon. The Bible was correct. What it says is actually historically accurate. One more on historical accuracy, and this takes us to a group of people called the Hittite people. Now, the Hittites, let's talk about these people for a moment. They are mentioned some 40 times in the biblical records, but there's no mention of them outside of the biblical records, evidently according to scholars, up until the 1860s. And so they said the Bible is wrong. This is a mistake. This is a Bible blunder, because we've never found any mention outside of the Bible of these people called the Hittites. Notice an example in the biblical records. Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the king of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians. Now notice it puts the Hittites alongside the Egyptians, interestingly, even in the Bible. We'll come to that in a moment. So there's one example of the 40. Now, if you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica of the 1860s, for example, you probably haven't read the 1860s edition lately, but if you do, you will find that there are only 8 lines on the Hittites, and pretty much it's from the Bible. Now, archaeologists got to work in what we call central Turkey and found great cities like this one here. This is Hattusa. They discovered that this is actually the capital of the mighty Hittite people. Huge place. You need a bus to get around this place to look at everything. The great gates into part of the city. Then they have, just up the road, there's a temple with Hittite gods and these interesting little characters here, typical Hittite inscriptions. These people certainly existed. In fact, if you've ever gone to Egypt, maybe you visited once the great temple of Ramesses at Abu Simbel. And if you haven't, if you go to Egypt one day, go down there if you can, and you will see inside this huge temple of Ramesses II down at Abu Simbel, there is a picture of Ramesses II fighting the Hittites. Now, because they could now read the Egyptian hieroglyphs, lo and behold, they found that even the Egyptians mention the Hittites. So it's not just a Bible idea. Clearly the Bible is reflecting accurate history. And finally, if you go to the Istanbul Museum in Turkey, you can see on display an Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty between Hattusili III, the king of the Hittites at this time, and Ramesses II. So you can see the biblical writers were absolutely historically accurate. What they said was absolutely correct. They were reflecting what was taking place. Now, I'm going to close with just 2 predictions because we need to look at this second part. By the way, the Hittite Empire we now know rivaled even the Egyptians and the mighty Assyrians. They were not a minor power. The Bible writers got it absolutely correct, and the historians had to rewrite their history. So, historical accuracy. This is why one of the greatest archaeologists of our age, that's W.F. Albright, he's now dead, this man who wrote over 800 works on archaeology and was actually the director of the American Schools of Oriental Research. Let's go back here. This is one of the creme de la creme archaeological societies in the Middle East. This is what he said. Notice, in the center of history stands the Bible. This guy dug in the Middle East for some, I think, 30 years. Thanks to modern research, archaeology, we can now recognize its substantial historicity, meaning it's historically accurate. To sum it up, we can now treat the Bible from beginning to end as an authentic document of religious history, says this man. In other words, we can depend on its historical accuracy. So we can tick that one off. But let me share with you 2 predictions from ancient times, and then Peter is going to share one very detailed, incredibly detailed, but I want you to see just for a moment that the biblical writers certainly got it right when it came to a proven track record of fulfilled predictions as well. Let's come back to Egypt. There are specific predictions in the Bible made about the Egyptians. And I'm just going to share with you 2 as we close. First one is the papyrus reed prophecy, made around 700 BC. Papyrus grew prolifically in Egypt in ancient times. You can see it on the right, that's the papyrus. You can see it here in their papyrus documents. And this papyrus reed. What did they use papyrus for? Well, first of all, they made paper. That's why it's called paper. It comes from this word papyrus here. They made paper. You slice the reed and you lay it out, and you sort of lay it out in different directions like 3-ply if you could, and squeeze together. They also made papyrus boats out of it. This is not a papyrus boat because we don't have papyrus there at the moment. You can see why. Here's the prediction that was made by the prophet Isaiah, 700 BC, about this reed. The paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. Interesting prediction when papyrus grew prolifically. Now, today you can go along the Nile River in Egypt and you won't find papyrus. You'll find it in other places of the Nile River, other countries, but not in Egypt. For some reason, papyrus seems to have died out in Egypt since those times. Thor Heyerdahl, some of you remember this guy, great explorer, adventurer back in the 60s. He was famous for what we call the Kon-Tiki, remember that? He went to Egypt to look for papyrus. Notice what he wrote. Pharaoh lies in his tomb with reed boats painted on the stone walls. Stone in the desert and reeds on the shore of the Nile. That's what you see in the pictures of ancient Egypt. Stone and reeds were nature's gift to the ancient peoples of the Nile. No papyrus grows in Egypt now. Not a single golden-haired papyrus reed bowed its bushy head over the bank to mirror itself in the brown water of the Nile. Papyrus had died out in Egypt. No one knew why, says Thor Heyerdahl. The gods had taken back one of their oldest gifts as if they had simply pulled it up by the roots. Interesting quote, isn't it? The Bible prophets predicted it will not exist here anymore, and that's exactly what we see today. There is a little bit. If you go to the old Cairo Museum, they've just made their new one, but this used to grow out the front here to remind people. This was a great reed that once grew prolifically on the Nile, but not today. The last one, the Memphis prediction, also made around 600 BC. Memphis was the capital of ancient Egypt for some 500 years. Notice what the Bible says. Pack your belongings for exile, you who live in Egypt. For Memphis, at the time when it was a powerful city in Egypt, Memphis will be laid waste and lie in ruins without inhabitant. Well, you can visit Memphis today, and that's the best thing you'll see in Memphis. That's the Sphinx here. That's pretty much all you'll see about Memphis today. Let's have a wander around. These are some of the ruins of temples. It's all finished. You can even see this is where Memphis used to be. Amelia Edwards, an Egyptologist, came here. Notice what she said about this place some years ago now. Where are the stately ruins which even in the Middle Ages extended over a space estimated at half a day's journey in every direction? One can hardly believe that a great city flourished on this spot or understand how it should have been effaced so completely. Wow. When I read those things many years ago, these predictions, and in the light of archaeology, this book is absolutely accurate and its prophecies are dependable. But this is nothing compared to what Peter's about to share with us, you'll see very clearly. So prophetic reliability we're going to be starting to see now. And in our next presentation, the Prophetic Code, Peter will actually unlock one of the great predictions made in the book of Daniel, which was a favourite of these people. So Peter, I think we need to do a swap here somewhere. 5 minutes, is it? Yeah, okay. Stretch your legs. Maybe you want to stand, stretch out your arms. I'll hand over to the ladies who are looking after us. Then we'll get into this incredible prediction that Peter's going to be sharing with us.
That would be great. And we just had a little request. If you can kind of squidge up a bit because so then other people can fit in. Just get to know your neighbour. Say hello.
Plenty of room on the front row.
Yeah, there's lots of room on the front row and on the side. So yeah, beautiful. So welcome everybody. My name's Naomi Hanbury and we're so pleased that you're all come out on this beautiful sunny winter's day. We're really lucky to have such beautiful weather here. So for those of you who may have just come late or just come now, I'll just repeat what we said earlier, which was that we've got one more session now, two more sessions now, and then we've got lunch, and it's prepared for you, so don't run away, and it's beautifully prepared. All the ladies are in there doing that now. And then after lunch, there'll be 2 more sessions, so you don't miss that. And wasn't this morning fantastic with Gary? Wasn't it wonderful? Just short, sharp, and to the point. Excellent. So what we've got now is we've got Peter Watts with us. So I thought, just as we did with Gary, we might just get to know him a little bit. So welcome, welcome, Peter.
Naomi, right?
Yeah, Naomi, that's
good.
right. Just checking.
Thank you.
I detect a little tiny bit of an accent there. So I'm guessing that you weren't born here and that you came here in a particular way, I've heard, and then you stayed here and you're still here. So maybe you could just enlighten us all about what that's about.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Yes, I come from Birmingham, England. That's where I was born and raised for about 25 years. And I just met Phil from Alum Rock in Birmingham, which was terrific. So that was nice. But I came here as a backpacker and came here with a couple of mates and first landed in Perth 29 years ago. It's my first trip back to Perth since. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
That's great.
And was in Perth for about, I think about 3 months and then went over to the East Coast to look for work as a backpacker. And I met my wife, and the rest is history. Ended up staying in Australia, and have been in Australia about 29 years.
Ah, so it's her fault.
It really is, but it was a very good thing.
Great. And what do you love about Australia the most?
Wow, lots and lots of things. Actually, when we were living on the East Coast, one of the things that I really loved was the parrots, because you don't have parrots in England. And
Not
you know,
the
I just
feathered
loved,
kind, anyway.
Well, that's right. And there's so many things. I mean, in lots of ways, I've visited lots of countries in the world, but I actually think Australia is the best country in the world. Don't tell anybody.
It is,
especially don't tell the English.
We won't.
But you've got so much here. You've got a whole continent to yourselves. You've got all the various different terrain. You've got the snow if you want it. You've got the rainforest. You've got the beaches. You've got the, land for growing crops and everything else, and the beautiful climate. And but it's the people. People are great too.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. And whereabouts are you living now then?
Right, I live in Hobart in Tasmania, chilly Hobart, but I'm appreciating the 4-season climate, which I was used to back in England.
Yeah, beautiful. And just like with Gary, I thought maybe I'll ask you a little bit about your interest in what you're going to talk to us about today, and maybe some things that have stood out to you on your international travels, and maybe some of the digs and the places you've been to. Because I know you're going to talk a lot today about that, but maybe just a little bit to whet our appetite.
Yeah, so my interest in these things, what I'm going to talk about today is we're going to talk about, I'll just advance that one, the Prophetic Code. We're going to look at some of the prophetic evidence. Gary talked about the historical accuracy. We're going to look at some of the prophetic evidence today, and those things I knew nothing of up until my mid-20s. And
what do you mean by prophetic code?
So, well, we're going to talk about some ancient predictions, and we're going to have a look at whether or not those predictions have come true. And so we're going to take a look at that in several of the programs that we've still got left. But what I discovered changed the course of my life. So it was a big deal, and we'll share more as we go through this series, but it changed the direction of my life in many ways. Gary mentioned that we were on a dig in Israel together, and we were digging in a settlement that had been occupied by the Greeks, and there were a lot of Greek culture there, and sometimes you're digging and you often find pottery and you'll find bone, but I found a bronze coin, which was
Wow.
terrific. So I was, I was very happy to find that. That was probably the highlight of my archaeological career.
How old was that coin?
That coin would have been 200 BC.
Wow.
Yeah, 200 BC.
Were you allowed to keep it?
I was not. But I have a photograph.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and look, I think that in traveling to various different countries, one of the things is that you find that people are the same. There's good people and less good people in every culture and everywhere. But many of the times that you meet people, they have the same concerns. We all need air to breathe and food to drink and water to drink and food to eat. And we all care about what's going to happen to our children, our grandchildren, and people have those common needs. Yeah. And I think we're going to be able to talk to some of that as well, even as we look at some of the prophetic code.
Beautiful. Thank you, Peter. Well, we're really interested in hearing what you have to say, especially with how things that you've discovered change the direction of your life. I think that sounds really interesting. So I'll hand you over to Peter, and thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Well, good morning again. Yes, please give Naomi a hand. That's a good idea. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the prophetic code, and we're going to take a look at specifically a prophecy that's found in some of those scrolls that they found down at Qumran on the banks of the Dead Sea. And Gary mentioned this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and they were found in those clay pots. And we've told the story. In fact, I should have brought it with me. I have in my office at home a copy of National Geographic advertising the fact that it's 75 years since they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as Gary mentioned, Muhammad al-Wahib, he was the sort of goat herder that was going through that area, and he actually found the scrolls and then ended up selling them on, and they were sold on to collectors, and today, of course, they are priceless. In fact, I'll just go back here. There are a number of caves. This is New Cave 12 down here. It's still possible that they may find more caves. There's a lot of caves in that area, but they found 12 caves where they found scrolls or fragments of scrolls. Okay, and the New Cave 12 was a relatively recent find that they found more scrolls, so they may yet find more of them. And of course, today those scrolls are housed in the museum in Jerusalem. But amongst those scrolls, they found copies of the Old Testament book of Daniel. He's regarded as a prophet who lived around 620 to 538 BC. And in the book of Daniel, if you go to any Bible that you might find in a motel room or in a hospital, or maybe you have one at home, you can get them on the phone these days. I've got a copy of the Bible on my phone. But you will find that there in the Old Testament is the book of Daniel, and it's basically split into two parts. There are historical records there of Daniel recording events and stories of his time, and that occupies most of the first half of the book. And then in the second half of the book, there are some prophetic predictions. And we're going to take a look specifically at one of those in this particular part of the program. So how do we know that the book of Daniel is actually as old as it claims to be? When you read the book of Daniel, Daniel is recording events, and the writer of the book of Daniel is claiming that those events took place at the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, i.e. the 6th century BC. But we want to know, particularly in the area of prophetic predictions, do we know for sure that it was written in the 6th century BC? How old is the book? And there are several lines of evidence. We're going to take a look at 5 lines of evidence that help us to understand that this is, in fact, an ancient manuscript, that this is an ancient piece of writing. And the first evidence is the New Testament. In the New Testament, you have Jesus talking to his followers, talking to his disciples, and he talks about the fact that he actually quotes Daniel. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, he mentions that. And he mentions it in such a way that he's expecting his audience 2,000 years ago to know who this man is. When he mentions Daniel the prophet, He doesn't have to explain who that is. They understand who that is because those writings already exist. In other words, they already existed as part of what we might refer to as the Old Testament. They existed as the ancient Hebrew scriptures. So we know that they existed before 2000 BC because they're referred to in the New Testament. The second line of evidence in regards to the age of the book of Daniel is the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we alluded to. This is from 100 to 200 BC, and they had several copies of the book of Daniel in that collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know that they're at least that old. Another piece of evidence is the writings of Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish Roman historian. He lived and operated in the 1st century, and he actually recorded, he wrote down a history of the Jews. But he also recorded some other things. He was there, for instance, at the destruction of Jerusalem, and he recorded a lot of the details of that. But he references that Alexander the Great, around 332 BC, came to Jerusalem, and the high priest came out to meet Alexander the Great and showed Alexander the Great the book of Daniel. And that Greece was mentioned in the book of Daniel. And it says that Alexander the Great spared the city because of that event. So that's what Josephus records as history in terms of the Jewish people in his writings, which is interesting. Another evidence number 4 for the dating of the book of Daniel, is the subject of the last king of Babylon. So a couple of hundred years ago, scholars believed that the last king of Babylon was a man by the name of Nabonitis, that he was the last king of Babylon. And of course, in the Bible, if you read the Old Testament book of Daniel, in chapter 5, it describes the fall of Babylon and the king that was ruling and reigning at that time, and his name was Belshazzar. And the scholars said, well, we have other records, archaeological records, that we know that the king list ends in Nabonitis. So the Bible must be wrong on this point. The book of Daniel must be wrong on this point. Until, of course, they discovered the Nabonitis Cylinder. And this you can find in the British Museum, and it was discovered in 1881. It's only about that long. It's not the Nabonitis Cylinder is not a big piece of evidence, but it's a very important piece of evidence. And in it, it describes the fact that Nabonitis had a son. His son's name was Belshazzar. It mentions him there. And a little later on, Belshazzar, son of Nabonitis, that's what it says there. In another piece of archaeological evidence, the Nabinitis Chronicle, which actually was discovered a couple of years earlier, but you know, sometimes they'll discover these things, they'll collect them all, they'll put them back in the museum, they'll stick them in a drawer, and they may not read them for a long, long time. And they read in this Nabinitis Chronicle the fact that Nabonitis himself had actually moved from Babylon and went to Timar, which is in what we would call Saudi Arabia today, and he was staying there at the time that Babylon fell. In other words, his son was present and reigning, Belshazzar, in Babylon when it fell, when the kingdom of Babylon fell. And it says here, Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar in the 3rd year of his reign. And so scholars realized, hey, actually, it was accurate after all. You know, we didn't have this information, now we do, and it's actually accurate after all. And so now we understand that Belshazzar was a co-regent, joint king of Babylon with Nabonitis at the end of the Babylonian Empire. And then the 5th evidence, something that Gary alluded to, was the Aramaic. The book of Daniel is an interesting book because part of it is written in Aramaic. Most of it's written in Hebrew. Most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. But there's a significant section of Aramaic, which is another form of ancient language. It was kind of the language of commerce. It was the language of international trade. And the Aramaic of the book of Daniel matches the Aramaic of the 6th century BC. In other words, there's phrases there, there are words there that are used in that Aramaic in the period of the 6th century BC that match the book of Daniel. And so we have every confidence that when Daniel writes, and he says, I, Daniel, He's claiming to actually be there. This is not somebody later who's writing. And it's important to understand that as we take a look at one of the ancient prophecies in the book of Daniel. And this is interesting to us because it predicts the rise of Greece around 332 BC. It predicts even the rise of Alexander the Great, who was, of course, the first ruler, leader of the Greek Empire. And so we're going to take a look at it. We're going to take a look at chapter 8 of the book of Daniel. And what we find there is principally a battle between two creatures. There is a ram and there is a goat in the book of Daniel. And you say, well, what is that all about? What does that mean? Quite simply, those two animals simply represent nations or kingdoms or powers. And we shouldn't find that too difficult to understand because we actually still do the same thing today. So if I was to say to you, this weekend the Wallabies are playing the Springboks, who would the Wallabies be? Australia. And who would the Springboks be? So that's exactly right. So these guys, I think, have got a wallaby on their shirt somewhere over here. There it is, on his shorts. And this guy here has got a springbok on his shorts. A springbok is like a little gazelle or a little deer. And they use those animals to represent the countries. Okay? And simply put, in the book of Daniel, that's what it does. In fact, not only in the book of Daniel, you find it in other passages of the Bible where they use animals to depict different kingdoms, different nations. And that's what we have going on here. So we're going to read something from Daniel chapter 8, bearing in mind that what Daniel sees in vision is a battle between this ram and this goat. Let's read about it in Daniel chapter 8. This is verse 3 to 4. It says, "Then I lifted my eyes and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." It goes on. "And as I was considering," now I just want to pause there for a moment. It says that this ram became great. Bear that in mind. Verse 5, "And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand." So effectively it starts out by saying this ram was really powerful and there was just nobody who could stand up to him. But then it describes this goat comes along and he's even greater and overcomes the ram. And it tells us in the passage itself who these two animals represent. If you go down to Daniel 8 and verse 20, it says, "The ram which you saw, having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia." So the ram with two horns represents the kingdoms of Media and Persia. Now, you may have heard of the Persians. You probably have. We've got Persian cats, Persian rugs, the Persian Gulf. You've heard of the Persians, right? But you've probably never heard of the Medes. But in ancient time, the Medes and the Persians were a coalition power. Now, up until the last election, we had a coalition government, didn't we? The Liberals and the Nationals. That was a coalition power. Well, this was a coalition power, the Medes and the Persians. The Medes kind of lived in northern Iran and northern Iraq. And the Persians were in the south, and they became a coalition power. But the Persians ended up becoming much greater, and that's why we remember them in history. The Medes kind of faded off the scene. I was talking to somebody who was from Iraq, and he was saying, you know who the descendants of the Medes are? They're the Kurds. You ever heard of the Kurds? They're like a stateless people in northern Iraq and, eastern Turkey. And he says they are the descendants of the Medes. But anyway, we've heard of the Persians. So the Medes and the Persians, that's what's represented by the ram. It goes on to say in Daniel 8:21, "And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece." So the goat represents Greece. the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. So here you have Medo Persia represented by the ram, the goat represents Greece, the prominent horn represents the first king of the Greek Empire. And there are no prizes for guessing that that is actually Alexander the Great. That represents Alexander the Great. Notice what it says here. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. Alexander the Great, probably the greatest military genius that the world has ever known. And that's not necessarily something to celebrate. There's a lot of bloodshed to do with that. But he is regarded as one of the greatest military geniuses that ever lived. And he would take his army sometimes against overwhelmingly larger forces, and he would be able to defeat them through strategy. And he came to prominence at about the age of 20 when his father, Philip of Macedon, died. He took over and he went south to Egypt and he went east through the Persian Empire, defeated the Persian Empire, and even made it all the way to the river of India. And conquered more territory than any other individual in a space of 12 short years. And then he finally perished. He finally died. He actually died. He was going to make Babylon his capital. He died in Babylon. And they're not sure how he died. They say maybe he died of alcohol poisoning, or maybe it was malaria, or maybe it was syphilis, or they're not actually sure. But I guess if you were sick back then, they'd give you a lot of grog. So maybe they thought he died of alcohol poisoning, but maybe that was the proposed remedy. I don't know. But it goes on. Daniel 8 verse 8, it says, the goat became very great. Now remember, the ram became great. That represents the Medes and the Persians. The goat becomes very great. We now know it represents Greece. It tells us plainly in the text. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. Alexander the Great died. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And so what happened after the death of Alexander the Great? He did not have a mature heir, and they said to him, who will the kingdom go to? And he said, it'll go to the strongest. And his generals fought over the kingdom, and they divided it up, and they ruled over various areas of the Greek Empire after the death of Alexander the Great, and that was Cassander, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus. And those 4 generals represented those 4 horns that came up after the prominent horn. You notice it says here, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. What does that mean? The 4 winds of heaven. Well, the 4 winds of heaven simply describe the compass points. You probably even hear it on the weather forecast occasionally. We've got an easterly coming in, or, talking about the wind. And so the 4 winds of heaven simply talk about the different compass points. And it says, out of one of the 4 compass points, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great. Now, I want to emphasize that because the Medo Persia, it says they grew great. The Greeks, it says, grew very great. This is describing a power that became exceedingly great. Came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. We'll refer to that in a moment. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. He cast truth to the ground. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. Now this power, this little horn power that became exceedingly great, we want to go and try and identify that. And we recognize there's a lot of details in these verses I just read through. And so we're going to break that up into little pieces to make it easier for us to understand. Notice the description of this little horn. So we've talked about the ram that was the Medes and the Persians. We've talked about the goat that was Greece. And then we talked about the prominent horn broken off. That was Alexander. We talked about the 4 horns Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And now we've got a little horn power growing out of one of those 4 compass points, and it says many different things about that little horn power, and we want to break them down. First of all, it says it went south, grew exceedingly great toward the south. It went east. It went to the glorious land, which is code for Israel in the scriptures, greater than Greece because it was exceedingly great, and it stands against the Prince of Princes, or the Prince, the Messiah. That's another phrase that's used in Scripture for the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. It says it cast down the sanctuary. Well, what was that? The sanctuary stood in the middle of Jerusalem. We'll talk about that in a moment. Took away the daily temple service, trampled on God's people. So there's 8 different predictions. Now, some of these predictions also have a spiritual application, but we want to actually look at the historical, literal application today. We want to take a look at who is this little horn? That's the question. Now, if I were to say to you, I don't know how well you know ancient history, but if I was to say to you that after the Persians came the Greeks, and after the Greeks would come an empire that was even greater than the empire of the Greeks, who would you think that might be? It has to be Rome. It can't really be anything else. It has to be Rome. Rome was an empire that lasted much longer than the Greek Empire, and certainly extended over a greater period and had a lasting effect on civilization, so much so that it even influences our lives today. And so who is this little horn? This is the rise of Rome. And that's what that little horn represents. So let's take a look at some of the predictions and some of the elements, because we're now down, the Roman Empire. They say that Rome wasn't built in a day. It didn't fall in a day either. But, the Roman Empire, we sort of put markers on it from about 168 BC to 476 AD. But notice some of the details here. It went south. Did it go south to Egypt? Well, yes, we recognise that Rome, from its home there and the capital of Italy today, but from Rome it went south, and not only into Egypt, but all other areas of North Africa also. In the prophecy it said it went east, and that would be towards Mesopotamia, and certainly Rome went in that direction also. A third element, it says it went to Israel, or the glorious land, and we know about that because, of course, when... we'll come to the details later, but certainly it was present in Israel, and you can read a lot about that in the New Testament, of course. In fact, the New Testament even has a book called the Book of Romans, right? So the Romans were very prevalent in the whole New Testament period. Another element of the prophetic passage said that it was greater than Greece, or in as much as it would be exceedingly great. If Greece was very great, this little horn power became exceedingly great. So whichever power we think this little horn to be, it has to be greater than the Greek Empire. And only the rise of the Roman Empire really fits. And you can see here the difference in terms of the expansion of the empire as well. Number 5, there are 8 elements here that passage that we read through in Daniel chapter 8 describes about this little horn power. Item 5, element 5. It says, stands against the Messiah. It talked about standing against the Prince of Princes, which is language that we find in the Old Testament to talk about the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah that they were expecting. And of course, the Jesus Christ, who came to earth 2,000 years ago, he was believed to be that Messiah. And you may recall, and maybe you've heard the Easter story where Jesus was crucified, and we have Good Friday as a national holiday, don't we? And that is to commemorate the fact that Jesus Christ was crucified on a Friday. And you may remember that crucifixion, you may or may not know this, crucifixion was a common form of execution for the worst of criminals by the Romans. And so there were thousands of crosses. It wasn't just that Jesus died on a cross. There were lots of people that were crucified. But Jesus is the one we remember. And you probably wouldn't think twice about crucifixion if you'd never heard of the story of Jesus. And so Jesus was crucified. It was a Roman method of execution. Roman soldiers put him there. It was Roman nails that they drove into the cross and so forth. And so they certainly true that they stood against the Messiah. Number 6, cast down the sanctuary. Well, we mentioned that in the middle of Jerusalem was the temple. It's still there today. You can go to Jerusalem. You can look over the Temple Mount. And at the time, 2,000 years ago, on the Temple Mount stood the temple, which was the Jewish sanctuary. And so when it says the casting down of the sanctuary, certainly the Romans had something to do with that, because Titus came and surrounded Jerusalem and eventually destroyed the city and destroyed the temple in AD 70. And that's why if you visit Jerusalem today, you won't find a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount. In fact, you find the Islamic shrine, the Dome of a Rock, right now, is what's on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Item number 7, it says, took away the daily temple services. Well, the daily temple services often had a lot to do with the different furniture that was in the temple. One of the items of furniture in the temple was this 7-branch candlestick. And this is actually depicted, it's quite amazing that this is depicted on the Arch of Titus. If you go to Rome, you go to the Colosseum, and just in the precinct of the Colosseum, you see the Arch of Titus. And in the Arch of Titus there, this is depicting some of Titus's accomplishments. And when he overthrew Jerusalem, they took away the temple services. They literally carried away the 7-branch candlestick from the temple services at Jerusalem. And then item number 8, the last one, it said trampled on God's people. And after the destruction of Jerusalem particularly, the Jewish people came under particular heavy persecution by the Romans, as did other followers of the Jewish Rabbi Jesus who became known as Christians. And there were all sorts of persecutions that fell upon Jews and Christians in the next couple of hundred years. And this is the Colosseum, of course, where some of those atrocities were carried out. In Daniel chapter 8, what we've read about in this brief passage of time, I hope I'm not taking too long, Gary. In this brief passage in this presentation, we've looked at 12 different predictive elements. You know, if we were looking at one, you might find some way of obfuscating that and saying, well, maybe it means something else. But you've got 12 different predictive elements here that we've seen fulfilled in history. So we have the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. Don't forget that when Daniel is writing in the 6th century BC, he's writing at the time when Babylon still rules. So you have the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, named by name in the book of Daniel chapter 8. You have the rise of the Empire of Greece, named by name. Then you have the division, the 4 kings, the division of the Greek Empire. Then you have the rise of Rome, and you have these 8 elements to do with the rise of Rome. All 12 elements we've seen come to pass in history. You can go to the museums and you can see the artifacts. You can read about it in the history books. They have happened. And the question is, how is that possible? Now, for some people, and I used to be an atheist. When I grew up in the UK, I was an atheist till my mid-20s, and I didn't believe in the supernatural. So I would have to find some way of answering this without an appeal to the supernatural. If you can't predict the future, how is this possible? I'd have to say, well, it must have been written after the fact. It must have been written afterwards. But we've already looked and we've already discovered that there is plenty of evidence for the early dating of this material. That this was in fact written before the events that it claims to predict. Now, what's interesting is Daniel himself doesn't take credit for this. He didn't say, I had this great idea. No, he said, I saw this in vision. There was something else, someone else, who gave this message to me. And I'm just writing it down for you to read. And so what we have here, either these 12 predictive elements are some kind of hoax that's being played, or it's actually the evidence that supernatural is at work, that there's something supernatural at play. And I had to come to the conclusion that it was something supernatural. Now, that's significant for several reasons. In my mid-20s, I'd never picked up a Bible. I thought it was a book of fairy tales and not worth. I thought it was like the Lord of the Rings. You know, I knew nothing really about it. But it's interesting, if you'd have asked me, I could tell you what the book was about, even though I'd never read it. You know, I could tell you what that was about. But I have spent the last 25 years studying the book, and what I find is, in the Bible, there's about 30% of the Bible is predictive prophecy. 30%. Most of those prophecies, the majority of those prophecies, have already been fulfilled, either in ancient history or in modern history. And we're going to look at some more of these prophecies in today's presentations. But most of that prophetic material has already been fulfilled. We can go check it out. And so then we have to come to a conclusion. Is this somebody's trying to have us on, or is it actually legitimate evidence that something supernatural, somebody does know the future? And that's important, not just because we're studying the kingdoms of Persia or Greece or Rome, but rather, does it have anything today to say about the day that we live in? And I can tell you that it does. And that's one of the reasons why it changed the direction of my life. And we're going to share some of that in the presentations that we're going to continue to present in this series. Now, we're going to let you have another break. And I think we had a bit of a longer break than 5 minutes last time. But we're going to say we'll have 15 minutes. Maybe you can do some star jumps or run around the block or get some blood into those legs. And we will come back and we will share the next presentation, which is entitled The Last Empire. This next prophecy in the Bible is one of my favorites in all the Bible. And it was this next presentation that made me believe that there was a supernatural origin to these prophecies. So don't miss that one. We're coming back in 15 minutes. Grab a drink, take a stroll, come back in 15 minutes, and we will look at the last empire together.
nodding his head. Yes. And the people out in the foyer, if you can come on in. And if there's anyone out in the courtyard, perhaps give them a hoy. That's sailors speak for hurry up. So this next series we're doing, this next episode, is with Peter again. And it's going to be a very, very important session. So it's really going to explain the very important prophecies that, to sort of kind of bring together what they've been talking about this morning, Gary and Peter. So if I can just remind you all to turn off your mobile phones and just scooch up if we've got extra people that have maybe come for this session. And just a reminder, after this, it's lunch. So if you've got you would have been given a little card like this from the gorgeous Rebecca who's sitting at the table. So if you've booked online and paid for the lunch, you would have gotten this little ticket when you came in. Now, if you came in and you forgot to do that, then just head over to Rebecca after and just talk to her and she'll give you it. If you did book in and you've got it on your phone or whatever, just show her that and then she'll give you the ticket. And lunch will be over on the right-hand side in the hall. So thank you, everybody, for your attention. And I'm going to hand you over to Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again, Naomi. Welcome back. Hope you stretched your legs and you feel thoroughly refreshed. We're going to now talk about our next presentation, which is called The Last Empire. And this is it's a special passage of scripture for me because I had a friend, I used to work in a restaurant, and I had a friend who came to work there who knew about this prophecy that we are going to talk about right now. And I knew nothing of it. In fact, I knew nothing about the Bible at this point. And this was the first passage of the Old Testament scriptures that he shared with me. And it opened my eyes to many things. So we're going to share that today. And I think it's one of the most simple of prophecies in the Bible, but I think it's one of the most profound as well. So let's have a look. First of all, we're going to look at a passage here in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, which simply makes a statement, but it's noteworthy and we want to read it. In Isaiah 46, verses 9 to 10, it says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other." Now, I'm going to pause there. In the ancient world, there were many nations who had many gods. You go to Egypt, they had many different gods. The Persians had different gods. The Assyrians had different gods. They were polytheistic. In other words, they believed in many different kinds of gods. But this passage is saying, I am God and there is no other. So in other words, this was monotheism, a belief that there's one God. This is the God of the Bible, the God of heaven, and so forth. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things that are not yet done. In other words, these words are claims to be the words of God that he gave to Isaiah to write down. And God is claiming that he knows the end from the beginning. It's just a claim. He's claiming that he knows what the end will be, even from the beginning. The ability to predict the future. And we're going to put that to the test again in this passage. I want you to understand in the New Testament, when Jesus Christ walked the earth 2,000 years ago, he was talking to his disciples. And in John 14:29, he said, "And now I have told you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe." In other words, when he was speaking 2,000 years ago, he was saying the prophetic things that he said about the future were not simply for us to have the knowledge of the trivia of this event's going to happen and that event's going to happen. How many of you may have seen the film Back to the Future? I think it was the second one where he found this almanac or something from the future and he was looking at the different football scores and all those kind of details. That's not what prophecy's about. Prophecy is given so that when we do see prophetic material come to pass, that it's fulfilled, we actually have greater confidence in the one who revealed it. That's the purpose of prophecy. So as prophecy we see unfolded through history, as we see it fulfilled, the purpose of it is to give us greater confidence in the one who gave the prophecy in the beginning, and that is the God of the Bible. We're going to go back to Iraq. We're going to go to the country of Iraq, which still makes the news, often for all the wrong reasons. And of course, there's been two wars there fought, major wars that Australians have been involved in and British people have been involved in and so forth. And of course, that had a lot to do with the leadership of Saddam Hussein, as you can probably recognize here on the left if you were around during the two Gulf Wars. But this was a painting that Saddam Hussein had commissioned and used to hang in his summer palace. And he had himself there on the left-hand side. In the middle, you've got depictions of ancient Babylon. And on the right-hand side is a character that Gary has referred to already, and that is King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar is a very prominent figure in ancient history at the time of the Babylonian Empire. He's a very prominent figure in the Bible's account in the Old Testament, but particularly in the book of Daniel. And so we're going to be going to the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But you see, Saddam Hussein saw himself as like an inheritor of the Babylonian kingdom. In a sense, he wanted to be as successful as Nebuchadnezzar. He kind of modeled himself on that, and even to the point where he would have some coins minted with Nebuchadnezzar and Saddam Hussein on the coin. Okay, and then he also had other paintings where this is a picture of Saddam Hussein depicted in Nebuchadnezzar's war chariot. Okay, and then you've also got the modern armaments of warfare around them as well. So what I'm saying to you is, for Saddam Hussein, Nebuchadnezzar was a hero. Wanted to be like him, wanted to be a great empire builder like him. And we're going to go back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar to unpack this prophecy that we find in the ancient Hebrew manuscripts in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. We're going to pick that up and take a look. Go back to ancient Babylon. What we find there in Daniel chapter 2 is it tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And we've also found out from Gary that dreams were important to the Babylonians. We found tablets, archaeological tablets, that depict dream omens. They write about them. They were important to them. And so what we have is King Nebuchadnezzar receiving a dream which was important to that culture, so he would have taken that seriously. And this was a very important, impressive dream. And he woke up, but he couldn't remember for the life of him what the dream was about. Ever happened to you? You had this vivid dream, you wake up, and then within maybe 15, 20 minutes, it's disappeared, and you can't even remember it anymore. But you woke up in a cold sweat because you thought it was real. I remember having one of those very vivid dreams. I thought it was real, and I thanked the Lord half an hour later when I discovered it was just a dream. But anyway, he's had this dream. He knows it's important. He can't remember it anymore. He calls in his wise counselors. They can't tell him. He says, tell me what the dream. They say, well, what was the dream? You tell us the dream, and then we'll give you an interpretation. But he says, I can't remember the dream. You tell me what the dream was. And they're saying, well, nobody's ever asked that before. And they couldn't do it. And he got very angry with them. But amongst those who were in the kingdom of Babylon, there was this young man named Daniel who'd been taken captive from Jerusalem, brought to Babylon as a slave, but then he was being trained to serve in the king's court. And he was asked, and he went and he prayed and he said, Lord, please give me the same dream. Because the king had said, I'm going to execute the wise men of Babylon, including Daniel. And I guess if your life was on the line, you'd be praying too. So he is praying that God gives him the same dream, and God does. He gives him the same dream. And he thanks the Lord, and he goes into the king, and this is what he says. He says, there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. That is a phrase that is referring to the last days, the end of time. He's made known to the king what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. And he begins to describe it. He says, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, that means a supernatural stone, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together, and they became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, so that the wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So he describes what the king saw in his dream. And the king got excited because he said, that's it. That's what I dreamt. He doesn't know what it means yet, but that's what he dreamt. And so this great image, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay, and then this stone comes and strikes the image on its feet. That was the dream. And now Daniel is going to describe what the dream means. He says to the king in Daniel chapter 2, verses 37 38, he says, the king of heaven has given you a kingdom. You are this head of gold. In other words, Daniel is saying the head of gold of that statue, that great image, represents you, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, represents you and your kingdom. And I'm sure that the king was quite happy about that, because we all want to be the head and not the tail, right? And he said, you're the king. Not only are you the king, it's a head of gold, right? You're the head. And that was a fitting symbol for the kingdom of Babylon, because even in the book of Isaiah, which was written before the book of Daniel, it says this, you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased, the golden city has ceased. So in other words, even in antiquity, Babylon was known as the golden city. So gold was a fitting symbol for the kingdom of Babylon. He tells him, Nebuchadnezzar, you, king of Babylon, you are this head of gold. Now maybe you've heard of Babylon. You know, there used to be a sci-fi series called Babylon 5. Got nothing to do with it. I think there was a pop group called Babylon Zoo. That was a few years ago. You wouldn't remember that. But you've probably heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, right? There was a list of the ancient wonders of the world, 7 ancient wonders of the world, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were part of that list. And so some people have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, even if they haven't heard of some of the other references. And so that was all part of the Babylonian kingdom. This is the Ishtar Gate. It's in the Berlin Pergamon Museum. What they did is, they collected all the tiles. I think Gary's mentioned this, and they reconstructed it. So when you go to the Berlin Museum, you can see that there, reconstructed. This was a gate that Daniel would have known about. He would have walked through that gate, I'm sure, and King Nebuchadnezzar would have walked through that gate too. And so here we have this image. This is the dream that the king had, and the gold represented the kingdom of Babylon from 605 BC to 539 BC. But Daniel did not finish there. He's going to continue to describe the interpretation. What does this dream mean? The head of gold, that's Babylon. Well, it continues in verse 39. It says, but after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. Now, there's probably two things that didn't really impress Nebuchadnezzar here. Number one, that there's going to be another kingdom after his. His kingdom's not going to last forever. It's going to be another kingdom. But to add a little bit of a twist to the wound, he says it's going to be inferior to yours. You're going to be knocked over by a kingdom that's inferior to you. And that kingdom, of course, was the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And, of course, Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have liked this. As Gary mentioned, they'd found lots of bricks in Babylon that had the stamp with Nebuchadnezzar's name on it and what he wanted to do. And one of them in the British Museum here, it says, the fortifications of Esagila, that was the temple precinct. The fortifications of the temple precinct and Babylon I strengthened and established the name of my reign forever. Nebuchadnezzar wanted it to last forever. But Daniel is predicting here that no, another kingdom's going to come inferior to yours. In fact, we've already mentioned that it's actually written, the history is written in many places, but it's also in the book of Daniel. In chapter 5 of the book of Daniel, it depicts how Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. And it says, you've heard this phrase, the writing's on the wall, right? People use that all the time. I remember watching an NRL football game on the East Coast, and it was the grand final, and one team was ahead by loads of points, and there was like 5 minutes to go, and the losing coach had got his head in his hands, and one of the commentators says, you can tell, you can see the writing's on the wall. And we use that phrase, right, because we know it means something's coming to an end. And it comes from this story in Daniel chapter 5. I mean, they even use that was even the title of a James Bond song, The Writing's on the Wall, right? But it comes from Daniel chapter 5. It's become part of our vernacular. And it's about King Belshazzar. He's the last king of Babylon. He sees this hand writing on the wall, and he's terrified. And Daniel comes in and describes what it means, and it says, your kingdom's finished, essentially. This is called the Cyrus Cylinder. This, again, is in the British Museum. It's about the size of a football. Aussie rules football. And it's Cuneiform Script, and it describes how Cyrus overcame the city of Babylon. And what they did was they stopped the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city. Lots of cities are built on rivers, have you noticed? What about Perth? You got the Swan, right? Melbourne, the Yarra. Sydney, Parramatta. You know, most even today, lots of cities are built on rivers. There's a supply of water. And Babylon was built on the river Euphrates. It spanned the river Euphrates, and the river ran through the city. And Cyrus decided he would dam up the river and march his troops in through the muddy banks of the river into the city of Babylon, and conquered the city of Babylon, 13th of October, 539 BC. Belshazzar was having a big party inside. He thought, we're impregnable. These walls are so thick that nothing's going to get through them. But they managed to get in under the walls. And the Bible, incredibly, names Cyrus by name 150 years before he's born. That's incredible. Well, I think at least 100 years before he was born. Isaiah 45 verse 1, it says, thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors so that the gates will not be shut. And they marched in through the gates under the river, under the bridge into the city of Babylon. Today you can go and visit Iran. Gary and I were there in 2019, Pasargadae in Iran. And this is the tomb of this is the tomb of Cyrus, I should say. But Alexander the Great came and visited this tomb. But Cyrus the Great, who overthrew Babylon, his tomb is there in Iran today. But Daniel isn't done. He continues with the description of this image. He'd said, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, you're the head of gold. Chest and arms of silver, they belong to the inferior power that would overthrow Babylon. That was the Medes and the Persians. But he goes on, he says, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. He depicted the rise of this third kingdom of bronze, and we've already alluded to this in our presentation before. This represents the empire of Greece. Under the leadership of Alexander the Great, conquered more territory than any other individual up until that time. And, I think when he got to the borders of India, I think his troops had just had enough. They'd been marching for 7 years straight, I think. And they said, we want to go home. And they turned back towards Babylon, which is where Alexander died. But Arrian's history of Alexander's expedition, written in 1814, he says, "I am persuaded that there was no nation, city, nor people then in being where his name did not reach. There seems to me to have been some divine hand presiding both over his birth and his actions." In other words, this historian saw what Alexander had accomplished, and he said that there must have been something that was guiding him or driving him or allowing him to be as successful as he was. And that's what that historian concluded. Mentioned before about Josephus in his volume Antiquities, it says, when the book of Daniel was shown him, that's talking about Alexander, when the book of Daniel was shown him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present, and he spared Jerusalem. But the prophecy and the explanation continues. There was a fourth kingdom. And Daniel goes on, he says, "And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. Inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others." And that kingdom represented the kingdom that would come after the Greeks, which we alluded to before, of course. And that was the Iron Kingdom of Rome. Rome ruled from 168 BC to 476 AD. And notice what Edward Gibbon, he wrote the volumes, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He says, "The images of gold or silver or brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successfully broken by the iron monarchy of Rome." Here this historian is using the language of Daniel 2, the language of the Old Testament, to describe the other nations and describe how Rome overthrew them. Interestingly enough, back in the late 2nd century, Rome is well and truly underway as an empire at this point. It's at its peak. Hippolytus of Rome, he was a Christian and scholar. Hippolytus of Rome, late 2nd century, this is what he wrote. He said, "Rejoice, blessed Daniel, you have not been in error. All these things have come to pass. Already the iron rules, already it subdues and breaks in pieces." Here's a late 2nd century Christian scholar who recognizes the pattern of this prophecy. He recognizes where he is in the stream of time. And the reason I'm sharing this prophecy with you today is we're going to find out where we are in the stream of time. When you walk away from here today, you should know, according to this prophecy, where we are in the stream of time. Because that's really important. And that's what we're going to discover. So here we have a late 2nd century scholar understanding this prophecy and where he stands in it. But he continues, Daniel continues with his description. Daniel chapter 2, verses 41 to 44, he says, "Whereas you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided." The kingdom shall be what? Divided. "Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, and as the toes," does it mention the toes? Mentions the toes. "As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile." And that describes what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was not defeated by another great empire. If you and I were betting, and we saw that there would be one empire and then another and then another and a fourth, we would probably say, well, that's going to be overthrown by the next great empire. If we were guessing. The thing is, Daniel's not guessing. It's been revealed to him and he's revealing it to the king. And he says that after the fall of Rome, the kingdoms would be divided. And thus they were. and have remained so. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many of the nations that we know in Europe today emerged from the fall of the Roman Empire. For instance, the Franks became the French. The Anglo-Saxons became the English. And the nations were indeed, the kingdom was divided. However, because they had been divided, there were many attempts made to reunite the empire after it had been divided. And many tried this. Charlemagne, he was declared himself the Holy Roman Emperor, and of the Holy Roman Empire. And you know, commentators now say, well, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't really an empire. But Charlemagne attempted to draw back the nations that had been divided after the fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, the title Holy Roman Emperor existed all the way from Charlemagne in the 9th century, I think, all the way through to the time of Napoleon. And they would give that title to various individuals. I think it was offered to Henry VIII at one point. Obviously before he split in the Reformation times. But Charlemagne tried to reunite the empire. Charles V of Spain attempted it. And we come to the time of Napoleon. Napoleon attempts to reunite the empire. He says, I wanted to found a European system, a European code of laws, a European judiciary. There would have been but one people throughout Europe. That was his plan. But you know what happened, right? You know the song, My. At Waterloo, Napoleon did surrender. I'm not going to sing it to you. You know the words. You know the song, right? And that's Waterloo Station in London. Because of the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated. His plans came to an end. And the Bible says the kingdom shall be divided. And so it was. Notice this, it says, as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Now this phrase here, they will mingle with the seed of men, that means their offspring. In other words, they would attempt through intermarriage to unite the different countries together. And we can understand this, right? Oftentimes on the news, we get this a lot because I come from Tasmania at the moment. Ever heard of Mary Donaldson? She got married to somebody, Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark, right? And so occasionally you'll get news stories about the royal family in Denmark. Why? Because she's married to an Australian. There's a bond between those two countries that didn't exist before. And so what they would try to do in ancient times is they would try to intermarry to unite the nations that had separated after the fall of the Roman Empire. This is Friedrichsburg Castle in Denmark. And on the wall there, you have a number of depictions of the various royal alliances that had occurred in the several, hundred years between the 500s and the 1900s, where you have these intermarriage to try and bring unity between the different nations, but it didn't work. You come to the time of Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm, he had a couple of cousins. One of them was the King of England, and one of them was the Tsar of Russia. The King of England, the Tsar of Russia, and the leader of Germany, all three of them were cousins, and they were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria. Kaiser Wilhelm is leading Germany, and this in the background is Metz Cathedral. Metz Cathedral is today in France, but at that time it was in Germany because they moved the border. So it's in Germany. It needs some repairs. Metz Cathedral needed some repairs. They said to Kaiser Wilhelm, would you help us with the repairs, with the expenses? And Kaiser Wilhelm says, I will help you with the expenses to repair the roof and the other bits of the Metz Cathedral if you'll do me a favour. There is a statue over the west entrance of the cathedral, a statue of the prophet Daniel. Will you take the face off the statue of Daniel and put my face there instead. And they did it. Believe it or not. I would not have believed this unless I'd seen a picture, quite frankly. So there's the prophet Daniel over the west door of the Metz Cathedral, and there is the changed face of Kaiser Wilhelm. And you know, I got that, like I said, I wouldn't have believed unless I saw the photo. I got this picture of Kaiser Wilhelm from the Australian War Memorial website, where somebody in the First World War been taking pictures, and he took that picture. As you know, Kaiser Wilhelm did not win. I just wonder, you've got to wonder, did he know about this prophecy in the book of Daniel that said they will be divided, they will not adhere together? Kaiser Wilhelm failed, of course, did not win the First World War, and then they took the face later, they took the face off of Kaiser Wilhelm, they put Daniel's face back on, and if you go there today, you'll see the prophet Daniel. The Bible says the kingdom shall be divided. This was written 2,500 years ago, friends. Of course, the next person who attempted to unite the nations was Adolf Hitler. He believed there would be one people, one empire, one leader. Who do you think he thought the leader should be? You know, he talked about a 1,000-year Reich. Remember? Lasted less than 10 years. During the Second World War, a few years ago, I met up with a friend, Michael Hasel. He's the grandson of this man, Franz Hasel. Franz Hasel was a German soldier. Well, he was drafted into the German army in the Second World War. But Hasel was a Christian, and he decided he did not want to carry a gun. He didn't want to kill anybody. And he was drafted into a unit that went in advance of the army, and they would build bridges. And so Hasel was issued with his pistol, and he didn't want to kill anybody. So what he did was he got a block of wood and he fashioned it and he put boot polish on it, and he put the block of wood that looked like a pistol into his holster and threw his gun into the lake. Because he never wanted to be in a situation where he was going to kill somebody else. What if there was a Christian on the other side? You're going to kill him? How would you know? And so he went through the war. In his unit, by the way, there was 1,200 men in his unit. Only 7 of them survived to the end of the war. He was one of them. He believed God protected him. One time, and he would read his Bible a lot, and he got a lot of stick. He got a lot of ridicule for reading his Bible by some of the other soldiers. But one of his commanding officers, towards the end of the war, he called him in and he said, Hasel, I want to know, do you believe we can win this war? And he's thinking, I don't know if I should say this. You know, he's saying, should I tell them that I think we're not going to win? I mean, you're telling your commanding officer that you don't think you're going to win the war? And there was a custom, and they would take off their hats and put them on the table. He says, this is off the record. You can speak plainly. He said, do you think we're going to win the war? He says, I don't believe we can win the war. Why? And he showed him this postcard. He had a postcard of the image of Daniel chapter 2. And he said, the kingdom will be divided. I don't believe we can win this war. His commanding officer brought in a history professor and a history teacher to verify what he had said about the prophecy. And after that meeting, the commanding officer decided to put supplies and fuel aside in order that they could get home after the war. And that's how they got home. The Bible says the kingdom shall be divided. Of course, since the Second World War, in 1957, there was the Treaty of Rome, formed the European Economic Community, or the Common Market in Europe. This was in 1992, becomes what we know today as the European Union. Okay? And as the European Union has been formed, there have been various treaties put to all the member states to sign to bring greater integration. And back in 2005, there was a referendum in France to bring greater unity to Europe. And the French people voted no. French voters have overwhelmingly rejected the European Union's proposed constitution in a key referendum. The no camp on both the right and the left is jubilant. That was BBC News report. Here's another one, 2008. They put a proposal to the Irish people. They wanted to one nation to vote on it. If they voted yes, they put it to other nations. But the French voted no, so now they're putting another proposal. Voters in the Irish Republic have rejected the European Union's Lisbon Treaty in a vote by 53 to 46. The poll is a major blow to leaders in the 27-member nation EU, which requires all its members to ratify the treaty. Only Ireland has held a public vote on it. Then, of course, we read, the kingdom shall be divided. That's what it says. You recognise this man, of course. The former Lord Mayor of London. Right, well, he's not the Lord Mayor of London anymore. He's Prime Minister. But this was when they were discussing Brexit. You may remember David Cameron was Prime Minister of Great Britain, and there were a lot of his party saying, oh, I'm mumbling and grumbling about all the money they're sending to the European Union and so forth. And he said, look, I've had enough. Let's put it to the people. I'm sure they'll vote in favour. In fact, I'm going to put my job on the line, and if they vote to leave Europe, I'll resign. He's so confident, was he? And that's what they did. They put a referendum to the British people in 2016. Boris Johnson was opposed. He wanted them to leave the EU. And I want you to notice what it says on this BBC News report, and it talks about the Sunday Telegraph newspaper. It says, speaking to the Sunday Telegraph, Mr. Johnson said European history had seen repeated attempts to rediscover the golden age of peace and prosperity under the Romans. Napoleon, Hitler, various people tried this out, and it ends tragically. The EU is an attempt to do this by different methods, he said. Boris Johnson could have presented this program. You know, he's talking about trying to rediscover the golden age of the Romans. He's talking about Napoleon, Hitler, and the EU. And yet, and this was, by the way, this is a month before the vote that he said this. The vote came 23rd of June 2016, and Britain voted by 51 to 49 to leave the European Union. And then there were a couple of years of debate and how's it going to happen, and finally, on the 31st of January 2020, Britain left the European Union. They minted a new coin to commemorate the decision. And of course, by the time we get to January 2020, what's on the horizon? Coronavirus. And when coronavirus comes in, what do the nations of Europe do? Well, they close their borders. And so this is an ABC news article where the different nations that made up the European Union suddenly found out where their borders were. They said, we're going to close the border. And they weren't quite as united as they thought. The Bible says the kingdom shall be divided. And that is how it is to this day. At the end of this description that Daniel gives to the king in Daniel 2:44, he says, and in the days of these kings, the divided kingdoms, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. It shall stand forever. God himself is preparing a kingdom. And he's saying in the days of the divided kingdoms, the God of heaven is going to set up his kingdom. It's described here in Revelation 11:15. It says, then the seventh angel sounded, and there was loud voices in heaven, saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. You heard the hallelujah chorus? And he shall reign forever. That's where it comes from. In other words, it depicts the fact that God's kingdom will come. Listen. The last thing that Daniel says on this, he says, the dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. How many times in the news in the last 5 years have you heard the newscaster say, we live in uncertain times? Or it's a politician, or it's a financial guru. We live in uncertain times. How many things do you know for certain? How many things that you can put your faith and trust in, you can know for sure that's going to happen? Well, you can know for certain that that rock that strikes the image on its feet and its toes, that's going to happen. God's kingdom is coming. We've been 1,500 years in the divided kingdoms, but God's kingdom's coming. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Imagine for a moment somebody gave you a tip. I don't know if you're a betting person. I used to bet on the GGs back in England a few years ago now. But I used to bet on the horses, and I stopped because I lost a lot of money. But imagine somebody rings you up and say, hey, I've got a hot tip, Flemington, 3 o'clock tomorrow. The king of Babylon, put your money on it. And you say, I'm not going to waste my money. What do you take me for, a mug? But he rings you up and say, hey, did you get on it? Oh, no, I didn't. It came in, won by 3 lengths. And you go and check it out, and it actually won. They said, by the way, I've got another tip for you next week. At 4:30, Prince of Persia, put your money on it. It's going to win. And you're not foolish enough to put your money on, but you're going to at least look out for the result. And it comes in by a whisker. But it wins. And he rings you up. He says, I've got another one for you next week. Alexander the Greek. And you're not going to put your money on, but you're very intrigued. And what you have here is predictive element after predictive element that comes to pass. You have the rise and fall of Babylon, the rise and fall of the Medes and the Persians, the rise and fall of Greece, the rise and fall of Rome. The kingdom would be divided. Attempts to reunite the kingdom would fail. And then God's kingdom will come. We've already had 6 fulfilled elements. They're in the history books. We await the final element. What I'm saying to you is this changed my life, because I understood that this book has a supernatural origin. And I didn't believe that before. And I was shocked. And I found out a whole bunch of other things that I was shocked about too. And you're going to learn some of those things in our series as you continue to come to these meetings. But I want you to think about, I got this from Gary, so I have to, I can't plagiarize. But when you go home tonight, I'm going to make a prediction. I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. But I'm going to make a prediction. Before you get into bed tonight, you're going to take off your shoes. And what I want to do is, when you take off your shoes and socks tonight and you look down at your feet, remember that we are in the feet and the toes of history. 2,500 years of history, and we're in the feet and the toes. And that kingdom is coming. The only question we have is, do you want to be a part of that kingdom? Because that's not going to last for 100 years. It's not going to last for 600 years. It's never going to end. And so I decided long ago that I wanted to be a part of that kingdom. I hope that will be your decision too. Thank you for being so patient. We're going to feed you now. It's going to be lunchtime. We're going to have some lunch, but please do not disappear, because we have 2 other presentations after lunch. One of which we're going to talk, the final presentation actually, presentation 5, I talk about how close is the rock? When is it going to happen? We're going to talk about that in episode 5, so please don't miss that one. We're going to take a break for some lunch. I want to thank all those who've been responsible for providing that. Thank you all for being so patient. And I'm going to offer a prayer. Would that be okay? Let's bow our heads where we are. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to you for all the gifts and blessings that you pour out upon us every day. I want to thank you for the way in which you reveal the future to us through Scripture, but only in a way as to help us to put more confidence in you, the revealer of truth, and the revealer of prophecy. Lord, bless us now as we eat together. We recognize that food is a blessing from you. We thank you for it. We ask you to bless our gathering and our conversation, and we pray that you'll help us to come back and learn a little more of what you have revealed. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's come back in about an hour, I guess.